Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives. And this morning we are going to be reading, and as usual, I'll make some comments along the way. Um, this book is A Law Unto Itself, the untold story of the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, 100 years of creating power and wealth. Um, a most interesting look behind normally closed doors, says Professor John Kenneth Galbraith. The authors are Nancy Lizagore and Frank Lipsius, and it is a pleasure to read this book to give us an introduction into what really I think is the guts of our financial problems today is the ability to create and extend almost a living person that exists only for the purpose of creating and saving and making more wealth. And this is the law firm that created this monster that we face today, the current corporate behemoth that tends to want to own everything and doesn't care how it gets it. And we can look at the Ukraine war as a great example of that, with BlackRock, Vanguard, Soros, all making deals with Zelensky, and the idea of owning the most fertile land in Europe, the largest breadbasket in the world, perhaps in in being. It could certainly become that, but taking it over and making it a food supply for their serfs and slaves, which is what they have the rest of us uh, lined up to do. And that corporate monster, that deep state animal that consumes everything and gives nothing, was created as a legal entity by many lawyers, but principally the main thrust of it is going on as we read this book in the early 1900s at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. So, and good morning, everyone. Corky, Robert, David, and thanks for being with us, you guys who are on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for being there, because I want to read to you. So let's get started. Okay, we're on page 53, chapter 4, Changing of the Guard. Introductory quote from William Nelson Cromwell, quote, "Darling mother, spend money and give away all that you wish, for there is plenty more to come as fast as you want it." Well, wish I could say that to my mother. Cromwell had stayed in Washington too long. In his absence, Sullivan and Cromwell made only one partner. Through the firm, though the firm had grown to 28 lawyers, the staff was demoralized and somewhat paralyzed without him. He was constantly drawn away, as when in 1906 Senator Morgan used his interoceanic subcommittee to conduct an investigation meant primarily to discredit Cromwell. During the hearings, Pennsylvania Senator Philander C. Knox asked Cromwell whether, quote, "the only compensation you have received or expect to receive, to have contracted to receive, has been from the new Panama Canal Company," unquote. Cromwell responded, quote, "absolutely, correctly, solely, completely, and truly," unquote. He did not mention that along the way he had bought 22% of the electric company in Panama. But that revelation had no bearing on Senator Morgan's contention that if the French had just gone broke, the United States could have bought the lapsed concession from Colombia at a fraction of the cost. He had whittled his complaint down to the unprovable charge that Cromwell had made a bad deal for the country. Of course, this is in the chapter we just read about the negotiation for the Panama Canal, and how the French investors in the prior company, the railroad company that went broke trying to build a canal, principally, I think, because of the illness of yellow fever. And whether it's yellow fever or malaria, it's killing workers by the thousands. So, how are they going to do that? Well, they're going to do it. And it doesn't matter really about the workers, does it? The weeks of Cromwell's testimony produced front page headlines like Cromwell dodges, Morgan leans, learns little, and still at Mr. Cromwell, Mr. Morgan, baffled, says witness has a remarkable case of lockjaw. Morgan asserted preposterously, quote, the assets and franchises were held to be worthless, its stockholders little better than common thieves, its officers paid schemers to be trusted under no conditions, unquote. Morgan's vindictiveness ultimately turned against him. The New York Times editorialized that he behaved like a, quote, farm dog that has once chased a woodchuck into his hole and cherishes thereafter the imperishable belief that it is his duty whenever he has an afternoon off to go and bark at that hole. Oh, reminds me of my dog Babe. She had a thing for woodchucks. We of course call them groundhogs down here, but yeah, they get up on their heels and I mean they get up on their haunches and like so they have these two little arms that they will punch at you with, but the main weapon of the woodchuck is those great big buck teeth in the front, which you threaten you. But that's not a problem for a dog. Dogs will win that one. Anyway, Cromwell, let's see, impressed by Cromwell's tranquility throughout the examination, the Times credited him with, quote, the patience of Father Time, as persistent as the attraction of gravity and smaller than chain lightning, unquote. It suggested that if as much energy were put into building the canal as into this investigation, some real progress would be made. Morgan's constant badgering only seemed to confirm that without Cromwell, America would have made an entirely different choice. Cromwell stayed even longer in Washington to help Secretary of War William Howard Taft, who was overseeing the Panama Canal excavation, in his bid for the 1908 presidential race. President Roosevelt warned Taft that Cromwell's, quote, past reputation in New York has been such that, as was said to me by a businessman in whose judgment I have entire trust, I can never be sure that someday he will not be working for a big fee in connection with this very matter, while you and I are entirely ignorant of what he is doing, unquote. Senator Philander C. Knox said, quote, we are in grave danger of public scandal of an unpleasant type if he is permitted to appear as too close to us. Still, Taft asked Cromwell to be his campaign treasurer. Cromwell chose instead to remain behind the scenes while recommending, quote, a J.P. Morgan man, unquote, George R. Sheldon, who took the official title. Sheldon, of course, is a name with quite a history. Prescott Sheldon Bush, the current senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, and the Sheldon name is just as old as many of the great New England names, such as Cabot and all the others. So, George R. Sheldon. Cromwell assured generous business support for Taft by giving him a $50,000 campaign contribution. Though Taft admitted, quote, we are greatly in need of money, he urged Cromwell to take the money back. It, quote, will be misunderstood, and the inference drawn from it will not be just or kind either to you or me. Cromwell refused. He said, quote, because of the blessings to the whole land which will come from the selection of such a great, wise, and good man as president. That's called courtier language, isn't it? A little more light. Ironically, Cromwell's enormous contribution allayed the suspicions of the president who told Taft to take the money. That's Roosevelt, of course, Teddy. He compared the donation to the one he got from another New York lawyer, Elihu Root. Not only had Roosevelt taken Root's money, but he had made him Secretary of State, a job many thought Cromwell wanted from Taft. Roosevelt told Taft to put Cromwell on the candidate's public advisory group. Taft kept the contribution, but refused to put Cromwell on any public body of support. He explained to Cromwell that Sheldon's corporate connections and Cromwell's ties to railroad robber baron E.H. Harriman made the Republicans too vulnerable to charges of being the party of special corporate interests. Yes, E.H. Harriman from the great movie with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Cromwell stayed behind the scenes, arranging details and troubleshooting organizational problems like the fights between campaign workers. He also prepared position papers on railroads and utility regulation, two issues close to his heart that needed the look of reform without jeopardizing business interests. Nice way to put it. It's got to look like reform, but it can't jeopardize business interests. During the Taft campaign, blackmailers, failing to get a payoff from Cromwell, publicly claimed that an American syndicate, including Cromwell, had made enormous illegal profits from the new Panama Canal Company. Cromwell decided to sue, surmising that the extortion claims might be part of a Democratic plot to smear Taft. Curtis discussed the subject with the New York Assistant District Attorney, who agreed to collect evidence quietly until the election was over. Curtis stressed the confidentiality of the subject. The next day, the New York World ran a front page story asserting that, quote, William Nelson Cromwell, in connection with M. Bounalvarilla, a French speculator, had formed a syndicate that included, among others, Charles P. Taft, brother of William H. Taft, and Douglas Robinson, brother-in-law of President Roosevelt. Other prominent New York financiers were also mentioned. According to The World, the syndicate parlayed a $3.5 million investment into $40 million, quote, because of a full knowledge of the intention of the government to acquire the French property at a price of about $40 million. Cromwell issued an immediate denial and defended his alleged accomplices. Quote, no member of the Taft family or Mr. Douglas Robinson ever had the remotest connection with Panama Canal matters, either directly or indirectly. The names of Caesar and Napoleon might as well have been used. The World had gotten the story inadvertently from one of Cromwell's three press secretaries, Jonas Whitley, who had called the paper to make a denial after the story had been dropped for lack of information. A good newsman on The World got Whitley to tell the whole story in the process of denying it. Cromwell drew attention to himself in order to keep it away from Taft. The controversy continued through Election Day, but Taft won a decisive victory, which elated Cromwell and vindicated their Panama policies. The district attorney dropped the suit for lack of evidence. If Cromwell had harbored hopes to become Secretary of State, the final Panama controversy scotched the idea, and Taft appointed Senator Knox. As eloquent in defeat as he was in victory, Cromwell wrote Taft that Knox's, quote, recognized position and preeminent qualifications fitted him for the premiership of your cabinet as no other man in public life, unquote. Before leaving office, President Roosevelt asked Cromwell to send him a complete list of new Panama Canal Company stockholders and a certified copy of the final liquidation report of the de Lesseps Company. The document showed that there was no American syndicate involved in the canal purchase. Roosevelt forwarded the papers to Congress, and in early December 1908, Roosevelt brought criminal libel charges against the New York World and the Indianapolis News. The World sent investigators and lawyers to Paris, Panama, and Bogota to collect evidence, but in court successfully filed for dismissal on the ground that the suit should have been brought before a state and not a federal court. Far from vindicating Roosevelt and Cromwell, the suit left the impression that the newspaper accusations were well founded. Cromwell finally returned to New York after Taft had been safely elected in November 1908. To make amends for his long absence, he established the Sullivan and Cromwell Society with a $10,000 donation. It funded an annual dinner for new recruits, old associates, and partners. The first dinner was held on December 29th, 1908, in a private room at the high society restaurant Delmonico's. The 20 lawyers there had their caricatures drawn and their renown assured when Cromwell, rather than let them take the pictures home, hung them on the office wall where they stayed for many years. Cromwell put his mind to rebuilding the firm. He was determined to make new partners, for though the firm was 30 years old, it was dominated by its first generation partners, Cromwell, Curtis, George Sullivan, and Alfred Jaretsky. There was only one younger partner, Francis Pollock, who in an office of more than 24 lawyers. With Cromwell away, the office was run by Uretsky, the only partner available to take on the work. Curtis had had a nervous breakdown and had gone deaf just at the point in 1902 when the issue of Nicaragua or Panama hung in the balance. Though the same age as Cromwell, at the age of 48, he suddenly seemed like an old man, burdened with a 3 foot ear horn around his neck. In other words, he was deaf and he had this big contraption to help him hear, an ear horn, 3 foot ear horn around his neck. The only new partner made between 1898 and 1908 was Pollock, a litigator who became partner in 1906 at the young age of 31, but died unexpectedly 10 years later. In reading Stephen uh, Kinzer's book about the brothers, about the Dulles brothers specifically, one gets the sense that a lot of these earlier partners just kind of died or got pushed aside or fell by the wayside during this period, right as Dulles brothers are starting to appear in the wings. The next new partner, made in 1911, was Royal Victor, a tough corporate lawyer capable of supervising the firm's dull but lucrative practice raising money for utilities. The job of writing endless indentures and contracts for a continuous process of money raising was tedious and routine, a task for associates who built the firm from 18 lawyers in 1898 to 28 in 1908. It had not just instituted its policy of taking young lawyers just out of law school to train them in the Sullivan and Cromwell way. Instead, associates came and went haphazardly, reflecting no policy except that they could not expect to become partners. The lawyers who joined Sullivan and Cromwell just out of law school, hoping to make their careers there, found instead that they remained associates for an unconscionably long time. Hjalmar Boyesen stayed as an associate for 20 years before he decided to quit to fulfill a lifelong ambition to live in Paris. Emery Sykes worked at the firm for 47 years, nearly as many as William Corliss's 50, but neither became a partner. In contrast with them, a succession of associates came and stayed for extremely short times, including the eventual Chief Justice of the United States, Harlan Fiske Stone, who spent less than a year at the firm in 1898 and 1899, but was always proudly claimed as one of the most illustrious Sullivan and Cromwell alumni. Now, Harlan Fiske Stone is somebody we need to keep in our focus, as we talked with David Cranmer Underdown last night about how he was a mentor to not only to J. Edgar Hoover, but also to Wild Bill Donovan. And that story needs a lot more fleshing out. So one of the most pleasurable things to me is to see how everybody's working on different aspects of this. And when I'm able to integrate David's work into my work, and Mark and Bill Taylor and all the other great researchers, it gives you a thrill. It feels good. So onward and upward. We're having fun here, right? Royal, that's Royall, Victor. I mean, it sounds like the name of a ship, right? It doesn't sound like a human being's name. It sounds like something that reflects the nobility of empire. The Royal Victor became the managing partner in 1915 at the age of 38. Despite his comparative youth, he was a man of definite opinions and habits. Associates knew they had to work until at least 4 o'clock on Saturdays because that was when Mr. Victor made a regular tour of the office. Known for his severity, he liked to keep a garden and was greatly trusted by clients like the American Agricultural Chemical Company, a major conglomerate in the chemical business of which he was a director and vice president. He was also a director of Detroit Edison and the Gold Dust Corporation, a popular soap maker. Director of Detroit Edison, another interesting connection for David. Tall, handsome, and self assured, with jet black hair parted in the middle, Victor ushered in a new era to fill in the middle ranks of the firm. He started recruiting lawyers from law schools to establish a pool from which future partners would be chosen. He also began the practice of farming out rejected associates to clients, which, like the firm, were just beginning to build up their staffs. To overcome the entrenched position of the existing partners, Victor appointed partners in pairs. For everyone who worked his way up in the firm, he made a partner of an existing partner's relative. Ooh. Victor's strategy encouraged his partners to accept additions to their ranks more readily, even when promotions entailed reductions in their own share of firm profits. The two partners made after Victor were Henry Hill Pierce, Curtis's son in law, and Edward H. Green, Jaretsky's cousin. Two of the next five partners were also Jaretsky relatives, his son Alfred Jaretsky Jr. and his son-in-law Eustace Seligman, both of whom played an important part in the firm over the next 4 decades. They constituted an unusually large Jewish contingent for a Wall Street firm of that era, though, as one former Sullivan and Cromwell lawyer pointed out, quote, they were all relatives. So the firm now becomes kind of a microcosm of the combination between the European elite and the European Jewish bankers. It's fascinating. I wonder how this Eustace Seligman fits in with other people of that name. And Uretsky is also somebody that needs a little in depth and uh, study, if that's still possible. Jaretzki is the lawyer's name. Jaretsky Sr. had been a poor Jewish boy who went to Harvard with George Sullivan, the son of Cromwell's original partner. Jaretsky showed that social standing was irrelevant to a practice like Cromwell's, which relied not on contacts as much as on a good head for figures. Cromwell established the liberality of the firm not from high mindedness, but because efficiency and prejudice don't mix. The young partners were also not practicing Jews. Uretsky Sr. made no attempt to hide his background, generously supporting such charities as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the Baron de Hirsch Trade School, and the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society. As president of the Agricultural Aid Society, Uretsky provided loans for Jewish farmers and underwrote the Jewish Farmer, an agricultural monthly in Yiddish. But Seligman, son of the famous Columbia University economist E.R.A. Seligman, now we know who he is, was a leader of the Ethical Culture Society, and his cousin Edward Green took on an active part in the Riverside Church. Seligman, whose relatives considered him violently Semitic, divided his active social life, giving Jewish and non-Jewish cocktail parties, both of which his relatives found stuffy and stopped attending. Riverside Church, of course, that's the Rockefellers' um, preferred venue for combining, all the religions into a kind of a Rockefeller-friendly faith, whatever that is. Under Victor, Sullivan and Cromwell made the most of Cromwell's utilities clients. In the forefront of both technological and financial advances by the early 1900s, the utilities were replacing railroads as the most powerful force in the economy. They benefited from increasing efficiency to cut costs at the same time that they raised rates because they needed massive amounts of capital to fund their expansion. Cromwell had pioneered the utilities work in the 1890s for his old client Henry Villard, who had returned to New York after the Northern Pacific bankruptcy to represent Germany's largest bank, the Deutsche Bank, and the Siemens Electric Company. Cromwell got Villard to buy out Thomas Edison, who wanted to go back to working on his next batch of inventions, including, quote, ink for the blind and, quote, artificial silk, unquote. Cromwell encouraged Villard to start a new enterprise to pick up electric companies and trolley car franchises in industrial cities throughout the Midwest, like Cleveland, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. In 1890, they created the North American Company, which survived strictly as an electric utility after the trolleys disappeared. Sullivan and Cromwell represented the giant utility under different owners until it was broken up in New Deal legislation 40 years later. Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers helped manipulate utility owners place, Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers helped manipulative utility owners place the rising profits into holding companies that by the 1920s gave three-quarters of the country's electric business to 10 companies. For its client, Union Electric, Sullivan and Cromwell created more than 1,000 subsidiaries. These companies, in turn, were dominated by a few individuals. Instead of issuing common stock, the management issued preferred shares and bonds that did not carry voting rights. To make money raising easier, Sullivan and Cromwell pioneered the open-end mortgage with which companies could borrow on corporate assets. So borrowing grew automatically with assets. Quote, never had the architects of corporate finance built with such craft and mystification, noted historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. The holding companies themselves were interlocked through their board members. Like the two Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers, William Nelson Cromwell and Henry Hill Pierce, each of whom served on the boards of 9 utilities. Alfred Uretsky was on even more electric company boards of directors, 16, including Detroit Edison, of which he was a vice president. Using techniques developed for the utilities, Edward Green helped the National Dairy Products Company become a nationwide milk and cheese company. Taking advantage of advances in refrigeration and dairy processing, National Dairy acquired a string of regional dairies and provided them with economies of scale and new products. In 1930, it acquired the Kraft Phoenix Cheese Company, that's KRAFT, of course, which was already a large international company with a brand name, eventually the corporate name Kraft Co., and a new product, processed cheese, that transformed a perishable, localized service into an international conglomerate. Wow, processed cheese. Green specialized in the financial side of innovation. He drew up the contracts that allowed Warner Brothers to make the first talkie films under contract from Western Electric. He established the patents for sanforizing fabric to prevent shrinkage and oversaw the merger of Merck and Company with Sharp and Doma. That's Dohme. Sharp, Sharpe, and Doma. He also applied his financial skills to the firm's own practice, acting as treasurer for many years and taking care of clients' tax needs until a separate tax department was established in 1934. Okay, drum roll. Here comes the name you've been waiting for. John Foster Dulles, ultimately the most important lawyer of the new generation, joined Sullivan and Cromwell after being turned down by Spooner and Cotton, the predecessor of Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell. Even to get into Sullivan and Cromwell, he had to rely on the influence of his grandfather, former Secretary of State John Watson Foster. And who were we talking about last night? From where was it? Was it right down the street from Terre Haute, Indiana, as I recall? John Watson Foster, who had known both founding partners. Cromwell had hired the elder Foster to work on the initial stages of representing the new Panama Canal Company in Washington. Foster had also clerked for Algernon Sidney Sullivan in Ohio in 1855. So that's the John Watson Foster that had done some work for Cromwell earlier in the Panama Canal saga. The young Dulles was a lanky bon vivant with a pipe-smoking swagger that belied his intellect. He got an academic prize at his Princeton graduation, which provided him with a year's study at the Sorbonne in Paris. Instead of going to Harvard or Yale Law School after Paris, he wanted to stay in Washington, where he could attend George Washington University Law School and take advantage of his grandfather's political clout and social connections. He took the socializing as seriously as the law school. His diary was full of entries about White House parties at which he sat next to the president's daughter, Helen Taft, while his law school notebooks contained only doodles, even when he was required to show them to the professor. Still, he got top grades, causing one of his teachers to remark, "He is the most brilliant man I've ever taught, and moreover, he is very ambitious. Any firm he is with is likely to do very well." You know, it's funny you think of him going to law school in Washington at George Washington University, graduating in 1911. And then a few years later, Macduff's father, my grandfather, Tom Sr., um, went to Catholic University Law to study and got a degree in law in 1919. So Washington, D.C., was where my grandfather, spent his late teens and early 20s going to Catholic University. And I showed you his diploma once signed by none other than Cardinal Gibbon himself. So all this stuff is amazing how we're all connected. I mean, one of the things that David is always awed by is how much connection his family has to these deep state institutions and characters. But the fact is, we're all connected. And, while he is done the work to show how connected he is, and I've done some to show my own. Everybody is connected to this. Nobody is unconnected. So let's use that. Let's remember that there's more of us by far than there are of them. And if we can exert our influence, pressuring upward to get rid of this corruption, we'll overwhelm it. We just have got to have this information out into the public so that their consciences, their common sense can kick in. Starting in 1911 at $12.50 a week, the 23-year-old Dulles found the routine of a new associate boring and frustrating. Used to things coming easily to him, he needed his grandfather's reminder his first summer at the law firm not to allow himself to tire of the drudgery of the office. I was a janitor and a charwoman, having to open the office in the morning, sweep the room, and get everything in shape for the day's work, unquote. Yes, and he polished up the handle on the big brass door. To quote a different Sullivan, as office boy, I made such a mark that they gave me the post of a junior clerk. I copied out the writs in a hand so free that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Grandfather Foster passed through New York later that summer to remind Cromwell to look after the new man. Dulles soon brought himself to Cromwell's notice by writing a pamphlet on the debate over whether American ships should have free passage through the Panama Canal when other countries' vessels did not. Dulles contended that the trips between American coasts through the canal should be considered domestic traffic and free of tolls. Cromwell wrote Dulles that the American Secretary of State had contradicted his argument, but Dulles's pamphlet got him invited to speak before the American Society of International Law, of which, not coincidentally, his uncle Robert Lansing was chairman. When his speech was included in the organization's proceedings, Dulles had 100 extra copies printed to pass around to his well-placed contacts in Washington and New York and at Sullivan and Cromwell. After a trip to Trinidad to scout out Caribbean trading possibilities for clients, Dulles practiced the art of verbal assault with the unfortunate shipping company that delivered him a crate of rotten avocados. Quote, I made a trip through the British West Indies as the representative of large American interests who desired a study to be made of trade relations between the United States and the British West Indies, he arrogantly lectured. I can emphatically state, however, that it is folly to attempt to create a market in this country for tropical fruits. Unquote. During this trip, he contracted malaria. That's interesting. The cure, massive doses of quinine, left one of his eyes subject to excess tearing and a tic he never lost. The malaria also forced him to take a nurse as chaperone on his honeymoon after he had married Janet Avery in the summer of 1912. Avery, of course, being that family's name, becomes the first name of Avery Dulles, the famous uh, cardinal, later in the 60s. Among the 200 guests at Grandpa Foster's compound in upstate New York was a long-term associate, Emery Sykes, bearing a $200 Tiffany gift certificate on behalf of the firm. 6 months later, Dulles was admitted to the New York bar. In 1913, Robert Lansing wanted his nephew to join a diplomatic mission to Britain. Lansing, who owed his own blossoming State Department career to his father-in-law, John Watson Foster, assured President Woodrow Wilson, quote, there was no nepotism involved, unquote, in picking Dulles. Lansing, known as Uncle Bert, lived with his wife in the Foster's Washington house, even when he was Secretary of State during World War I. But Sullivan and Cromwell considered the offer too unimportant for Dulles, who wrote his uncle, quote, it did not seem to Mr. Victor that it would be advisable for me to absent myself entirely from my work here for a year at this time when I am just beginning to get more intimately in touch with the work of the office and with its clients. The firm, however, was impressed with his contacts and soon had Dulles write his uncle to ask if the State Department could recommend a lawyer in Peru. As soon as war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Dulles wrote to his uncle asking the State Department to locate people on behalf of firm clients. When one German was discovered languishing in a Japanese prison camp, Dulles had the audacity to ask the department, quote, in some way to parole this young man so that he could return to the United States, where Mr. Merck will assume personal responsibility for him, unquote. I wonder what German that was and why he was so important to Mr. Merck. Dulles asked such favors with no qualms or apologies. His younger brother Alan was more appreciative of the family's extraordinary influence and the privileges it afforded him. Alan wrote home from a round-the-world trip, quote, it is a great thing to have had illustrious relations. I am certainly profiting by what others have been. Foster Dulles put even Cromwell in his debt when the United Fruit Company and a New York banker tried to get Panama to remove Cromwell as the country's fiscal agent. After secret correspondence with Panama, the State Department solicitor, none other than Robert Lansing, lobbied heavily for Panama to keep Cromwell because, quote, he was appointed with the approval of the Department of State. He has served with ability and generosity, and a change does not appear desirable, unquote. Not content just to save Cromwell, the State Department's solicitor's office abandoned its customary reserve and attacked Cromwell's enemies, claiming that, quote, the fruit company is trying to extend its domination into Panama, which effort, if successful, might or might not have happy results. Judged by the results which have been obtained by the fruit company's activities in Costa Rica and Honduras, it would seem that one result of its efforts in Central American countries is to stifle competition in the fruit business, unquote. World War I started when Dulles was a third-year associate at Sullivan and Cromwell. To take advantage of it, he volunteered to go to Europe and to get war risk insurance for the American Cotton Oil Company's European shipments. Dulles was working on such short notice that without a birth certificate, he wrote to his uncle, quote, I trust you can still put through my application and secure a passport. Along with the passport, Lansing sent Dulles letters of introduction to the American ambassadors to Britain and France and the consul general in Rotterdam. All the letters, at Dulles's request, included assurances, quote, that they, the ambassadors, may rely on the truth of any representations Dulles might make. Dulles traveled as a one-man commercial envoy, scouring Europe for business. His main job was to get war risk insurance for his clients to continue to do business in Europe. In Holland, Dulles advised the Holland America line about placing its own war risk insurance. Again, here comes my grandfather into the picture because my grandfather finally, toward the end of his life, he took a trip to Europe, toured around Holland, uh, Germany, Switzerland, and it was with, of course, the Holland America lines. And I still have a pair of ashtrays that he gave me from that trip back in the late 50s. Holland America line, yes, indeedy. And of course, Hamburg America line, well, are they connected? One suspects they are. He wrote his wife, oh, sorry, Holland, okay, in Holland, Dulles advised the Holland American line about placing their own war risk insurance, though he admitted to his wife he was not sure he was telling them right. While waiting for the results of the insurance company's deliberation on American Cotton Oil's war risk policy, Dulles visited the Rijksmuseum and played golf and tennis. After getting approval from the Dutch insurers, Dulles headed for England, where the streets were full of French refugees during the day, and at night, searchlights eerily broke the blackout looking for Zeppelin bombers. He wrote his wife one letter on the back of an advertisement for intimate apparel with the slogan, quote, every common sense Eve wears pajamas nowadays, for the Zeps come and one has to flee from the sanctity of the house. One wouldn't feel quite so much of a refugee as in a nightie. The last words in ladies' lingerie, unquote. He expressed his shock that the German policy of attempting to terrorize other people by ruthless murdering and torturing mentally and otherwise non-combatants, women, children, and neutrals. He realized that the constant barrage of recruitment posters meant English soldiers were dying as fast as they shipped out and felt that, quote, it would be hard to put one's life to a more useful service than to help wipe out the German military systems, which make all this horror possible, unquote. He relished the role of a neutral in the midst of battle. As a student at the Sorbonne after Princeton, he had stuffed paper in his bowler to ward off gendarmes' truncheons while wandering among the student rioters. He was an adventurer, but not a fighter. In Liverpool, he also did some business arranging war risk insurance. Dulles had to rush back to London to take care of Mrs. Billiker, a firm client who had survived the Lusitania sinking but lost her husband. Dulles arranged for another passport for her, wrote a new will including her husband's estate, and booked her onto a crowded ship back to America. Dulles returned home consumed with interest in the war. He spread maps out on the floor of the study in his East Side apartment and used colored pens to show the German advances and the French and Belgian retreats. He fumed at German victories. He finally had a chance to do something about the war when his uncle Robert Lansing became Secretary of State in June 1915. William Jennings Bryan had resigned after the Lusitania sinking because he thought President Wilson, who had vowed to stay neutral, had purposely provoked German aggression to get America into the war. Since the Lusitania was an armed British ship, the Germans had advised the United States not to let its citizens go aboard. Wilson ignored the warning, in part, Bryan suspected, to arouse American anger at the Germans. Lansing recruited Dulles to go to Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama on the pretext of firm business, but really to find out which leaders would support the United States against the Germans. Dulles was cruising to Central America, playing bridge and listening to the wireless, when on April 6, 1917, he heard America's declaration of war on Germany. He advised Washington to support the vicious dictator Federico Tinoco in Costa Rica because he was anti-German and ran a, quote, government and people with more sincere friendliness to us than any other Central American state. Dulles got the dictator General Emiliano Chamorro, president of Nicaragua, to issue a proclamation suspending diplomatic relations with Germany. Chamorro was particularly cooperative because the year before, Dulles had played a major role in Chamorro's election by introducing the Central American to his uncle. During the election, Lansing assured Dulles that the State Department had found, quote, the best means of advancing the interests of General Chamorro. Of course, you realize, he added, it is a delicate question to interfere in any way with the franchise in Nicaragua, and your policy must be very carefully considered. In Panama, his last stop, Dulles offered on behalf of the American Secretaries of State and the Treasury to let Panama continue to get its annual $250,000 canal fee tax-free as long as Panama declared war on Germany and protected the canal for Allied shipping. The new 1913 income tax law would have made these payments subject to American tax, a sticky issue Washington was glad to resolve to Panama's advantage, as long as the country was an American ally. Dulles' trip was a complete success and qualified him to work closer to his uncle in Washington during the war. Dulles got a commission as a captain for a position in military intelligence, working for the War Trade Board. Arranging to keep goods out of enemy hands, he got Spain to provide mules and minerals exclusively to the Allies in return for cotton and oil. He worked out an intricate legal scheme to secure 37 Dutch ships in American harbors without compromising Holland's neutrality. He dictated the confiscation order for the president to sign. With his brother Alan, an American envoy in Switzerland, Foster worked, quote, very hard lately on getting grain to Switzerland. We now have the grain and the ships, but as you know, the safe conduct from Germany is not forthcoming. He did send Alan tennis balls, which he wanted both for my own use and as a propaganda among my Swiss friends, unquote. The propaganda proved so successful, Alan needed, quote, as many good tennis balls as possible, unquote. Indeed, quote, every week until further notice, 1 dozen balls, unquote. Well, this had a reference to the uh, the line in Henry V, where uh, the Dauphin, the the, uh, the heir to the French throne, uh, sends a gift to young King Henry V, kind of teasing him and taunting him. in a box, and then they open the box, and President, I mean, King Henry says to his knight, says, "What what presents?" And the knight comes back, "Tennis balls, my liege." And then King Henry says, "Well, we thank the Dauphin for these balls with which we hope to uh, smash the Louvre when we play a set in France." So perhaps a reference to Henry V and the tradition of teasing people with tennis balls. When Dulles talked about war policy with his grandfather and uncle over breakfast, they constituted a formidable foreign policy contingent as a former, present, and future Secretary of State. Dulles mentioned the problem of important Sullivan and Cromwell clients, the major Cuban sugar plantation owners. They were worried about a rebellion by the liberals who had lost the recent election but maintained a stronghold in the area of the sugar fields. Dulles wrote a memorandum urging the State Department to recognize the liberal claims that the election was stolen by the incumbent conservatives. He cited as his authority Sullivan and Cromwell's, quote, unusual and diversified means of obtaining information, unquote, as well as its special representative in Havana, who has interviewed and obtained the views of men prominent in banking, railroads, insurance, tobacco, and sugar businesses. Sullivan and Cromwell concluded that the rebellion could not be suppressed and recommended, quote, appointment of commission of 3 to investigate election troubles immediately. Dulles's overriding concern was not the liberals, but American property interests in territory controlled by the liberals. A Cuban liberal representative huddled with Alfred Uretsky Sr. in New York and wrote a 4-page letter to the State Department, quote, electoral fraud perpetrated by the government, and calling on the United States to install a leader more favorable to American business, unquote. Sullivan and Cromwell wrote its own letter asking the government to protect American property, especially the firm's 13 clients who owned $170 million worth of Cuban sugar fields. One of them alone, Cuban cane sugar, organized by Sullivan and Cromwell 2 years earlier, accounted for 15% of the country's sugar output. Lansing sided with Dulles's support for the liberals, but President Wilson decided that, quote, the strong moral support of this government should be given to the established Cuban government, unquote. While the president refused to help the liberals, he did protect American interests by sending 1,600 troops for, quote, training purposes and, quote, as a protection for the sugar industry, unquote. They remained in Cuba until 1922. Sullivan and Cromwell's New York office had more prosaic problems, but contributed to the war effort by reorganizing the Aetna Explosives Company in 1918. That's AETNA, like the insurance company. Companies and rich people had to be extricated from German involvements, like Antoinette Converse, the hapless daughter of the National Tube Company and U.S. steel organizer E.C. Converse. She was repeatedly unlucky in love. Though she was in the process of divorcing a German count when war broke out, the final decree had not come through, and the State Department was forced to write to Sullivan and Cromwell that, quote, the government could not properly assist her in any official capacity. With America in the war, Mumm Champagne and Importation Company, a German-owned company, faced seizure by the alien property custodian. In a letter to the State Department, Dulles deceptively called the U.S. importer for Mumm, quote, a New York corporation with an extensive organization which is entirely American in its character. The alien property custodian found the instructions the Germans gave Sullivan and Cromwell to sell the company to its American management with Mumm's money, but hold on to the stock while pretending the company was American. The firm willingly helped the company try to evade the alien property custodian, but luckily the war ended only a year and a half after the United States entered it, with no casualties to Sullivan and Cromwell personnel or reputation. The next chapter is called Partners for Peace. And of course, we will then be moving into the negotiations at Versailles with David Lord George and all of those amazing connections that, wow, Sullivan Cromwell representing cotton, Edison, sugar, oil, utilities, E.H. Harriman. It is the story that continues today as the consolidation of these firms into more and more tightly controlled and larger economic systems strangles the rest of us economically. So we see how it's come together in this book. I'll be back with you next week for another edition. I think we'll be on chapter 5 then. And I will see you guys tomorrow at this time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, for a chat with you, McDuff's Friday Live Chat. See you then. Have a great evening.